I want you to stop the video right now. Not pause it, stop it. Because what I am about to say is going to be uncomfortable for some of you in a way that has nothing to do with disagreement. It will be uncomfortable because it is true. And you already know it is true. You have known it for a long time. You just needed someone inside this world, not a critic, not an outsider with a psychology degree and clean hands. Someone who built his life around this archetype to finally say it out loud. So here it is. For a lot of men watching this, the Sigma identity is not a description of who you are. It is a story you learned to tell yourself so the loneliness would stop feeling like loneliness. I am not attacking you. I am not standing outside this and throwing stones at it. I lived inside it. I built something inside it. I still stand here, inside it. Which is exactly why I can see what most men watching Sigma content will never admit. The label arrived after the wound. For men like me, men who actually went through the fire, the addiction, the prison, the silence, the years of standing outside every room, the word Sigma came later. It was a name someone gave to something that already existed. The solitude was real. The independence was earned. The emotional restraint had a cost attached to it that I am still paying. But for a growing number of men, it works in reverse. The label arrives first, and then the loneliness gets a costume. Online culture does not merely reflect psychological states. It offers roles to copy. Human beings learn not just by being told what to think, but by acting like someone, and eventually by becoming that someone. That is what is happening. A man feels isolated, rejected, passed over, unable to connect in ways he cannot fully explain. That pain is real. That wound is real. It deserves to be taken seriously. But instead of sitting with it, instead of asking why, he finds a video, then another, then another. And slowly the algorithm hands him an identity that reframes everything. The rejection was not rejection, it was discernment. The isolation was not loneliness, it was evolution. The inability to connect was not a wound, it was a sign that he operates on a frequency ordinary people cannot reach. The wound becomes a crown, and the myth protects the loneliness from examination. It tells him not to ask whether he is afraid, ashamed, wounded, or simply in need of better habits and better company. That is not strength. That is the most sophisticated avoidance I have ever seen. Here is where it turns. Because I know what you are thinking right now. You are thinking, but I genuinely prefer solitude. I genuinely do not need approval. I genuinely think differently. Maybe. Some of you, yes, absolutely. But let me ask you something nobody in this space ever asks. How do you know? How do you know the solitude is a preference and not a defense? How do you know the independence is chosen and not a wound that hardened into a wall? How do you know the silence is peace and not the quietest form of fear you have ever experienced? I could not answer those questions honestly for years, because I called every wall a boundary. I called every distance wisdom. I called every closed door a sovereign choice. Some of them were. Some of them were armor I had forgotten I was still wearing. The difference between those two things is the most important question a man can ask himself. And the Sigma label, the way most content uses it, makes that question almost impossible to reach, because the label already answered it for you. The Sigma male is just another example of romanticizing loneliness. Someone alone, gaslighting themselves into believing the isolation is on purpose, that loneliness is healthy, that cutting yourself off from the world is the right way to be. I do not fully agree with that, but I understand why someone outside this world says it. Because from the outside, that is exactly what a significant portion of Sigma content looks like. Men who are genuinely suffering from disconnection, from the collapse of male friendship, from the absence of real community, from years of being told that vulnerability is weakness, being handed a philosophy that tells them the suffering is actually superiority. That is cruel, even when it is unintentional, even when the man handing them that philosophy believes it himself. I have believed things about my own solitude that turned out to be survival mechanisms I had confused for identity. That realization did not destroy me. It was the first honest thing I had done in years. I know what the genuine version looks like, because I have stood inside both. The man who earned the silence does not perform it. He does not post about it. He does not need you to witness it to make it real. His solitude is not content. It is not aesthetic. It is not something he discovered between the ages of 19 and 22 while watching videos about wolves. It cost him something. It cost him relationships he wanted to keep. It cost him years of not knowing why he could not stay in a room without scanning for the exit. It cost him the slow, humiliating work of distinguishing between what he genuinely needed and what he was simply afraid to lose. That man does not wear the label lightly. When he calls himself Sigma, he is not reaching for an identity. He is describing damage that became discipline. He is naming a process that had no name while it was happening. The man who borrowed the aesthetic is different, not weaker, not stupid, just earlier. He found the label before he found the wound. He built the philosophy before he understood what it was supposed to be protecting. And the dangerous part is that from the outside, they look identical. Same silence, same distance, same refusal to chase approval. But one of them is standing in the ash of something that actually burned. The other is standing in front of a mirror, practicing the look. The mirror cannot tell the difference, but the man can. Deep in the place where the honest voice lives, the one that speaks at 3 in the morning when the philosophy runs out, he already knows which one he is. That knowledge is not a verdict. It is an invitation. The only question is whether he accepts it. So what is the difference between the man who genuinely built himself through fire and the man who borrowed the aesthetic to avoid the work? One question separates them. Does the identity demand something from you, or does it excuse you from something? If calling yourself Sigma means, I must be more honest, I must face the mirror harder, I must take responsibility for what I closed off and why, I must distinguish between chosen solitude and fear wearing a philosophical coat, then the label is honest. Then it is doing real work. But if calling yourself Sigma means, I do not need to examine my loneliness, I do not need to ask why connection keeps failing, I do not need to look at the walls I built and ask whether they are protecting something worth protecting or simply keeping everything out, then it is not an identity, it is an escape with better branding. I said at the start that I built something inside this world. That is true. I also spent time inside this world hiding from things I was not ready to name, using the philosophy as armor against questions I was afraid the answers would destroy me. The questions did not destroy me. Refusing to ask them nearly did. The man I was before prison, before the mirror, before the silence that finally had nowhere to hide, that man had a Sigma explanation for everything. His distance was wisdom. His walls were standards. His inability to stay was strength. He was wrong. Not about everything, but about enough. I am not telling you to abandon the archetype. I am telling you to interrogate it. Ask it the question it was never designed to survive. Is this who I am? Or is this who I became because becoming anything else felt too dangerous? Sit with that, in the actual silence, not the performed silence, not the silence you post about, the silence at 3 in the morning when the philosophy stops working and you are just a man alone in a room wondering why the door feels so heavy. That silence is not evidence of your evolution. That silence is the mirror, and the mirror does not care what you call yourself. It only shows you what is actually there. And what is there? Underneath the label, underneath the philosophy, underneath every wall you built and named a boundary, is just a man. Not a Sigma, not a lone wolf, not an archetype. A man who is tired, who wanted to belong somewhere and couldn't find the door, who discovered that if you name the loneliness correctly, it stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like a rank. I understand that man. I was that man. The difference between then and now is not that I found a better label. It is that I stopped needing the label to survive the silence. That is the only finish line that is real. Not the man who has the right philosophy, the man who no longer needs one to feel whole. If this reached something you have been quietly carrying, you do not have to say anything here. But if you have something real to say, not a defense, not a rebuttal, something true, leave it below. For the man who is still building walls and calling them wisdom, he is reading this right now, and he already knows.